Hey guys, welcome to Bookish Islander. My name is Juan. I hope you're all doing very well. I'm doing fine myself. It's already November. Would you believe it? Where is 2019 going? We're almost at the end of it. There are still 2 months ahead, so lots of books to read ahead of us this year. But today I wanted to look back and talk about all the books that I read in the month of October. And if you've been keeping up with my Friday reads, you would have heard about a lot of the books that I'm going to talk to you about today, but not all of them, because this week I wasn't able to do Friday reads. So I wanted to apologize for that. I'm sorry. Friday reads will resume. I enjoy doing my Friday reads. I know a lot of people enjoy my Friday reads because it's a good way to catch up on what we are all reading on a weekly basis. So I didn't do a Friday reads video, but I did finish some books this week, so I'll talk about them too. But I'm not going to talk about the books in the order in which I've read them. I'm going to talk to you about these books in separate sections because there were a couple of things that were going on in October in the way I organize my reading. So the first thing, of course, is Victober. As you know, October is the big month, the month-long readathon of Victorian literature, and this is organized by a couple of booktubers, which I mentioned in my Victober TBR video, and a lot of booktubers, and even people who are not on BookTube, people who are on Instagram or Twitter take part. So basically just read books from the Victorian period, even though there are a few challenges that you choose to do or not. In my case, because this was my first ever Victober as a booktuber, I decided to not do any of the challenges. So I had a TBR which was way too ambitious. I encourage you to go back and see it. But in that TBR, I said that as long as I finished Middlemarch, I would consider Victober a success. So I have news for you. I did finish Middlemarch in October. So the question is, did I enjoy reading Middlemarch? I did. It was a bit of a struggle. If you saw me talking about it before, you would know that Middlemarch is a novel that I started several times before in my life. Over the last 20 years, I've been trying to read that lovely book. And at some point I would reach around the 30-something% mark and I would lose interest. And would you believe that that happened once again? However, because I was committed to finishing the book before the end of the month, I went back to it and I persevered. And the book did get better from then on. What happens in that 30% mark? It's probably not quite mathematically exact. It's probably something that happens before, but it keeps going. And what that is that the narrative seems to move away from Dorothea, which is the main character at the beginning of the book. And it's a character that I was very much invested in. And everything that had to do with Dorothea, I was into and I enjoyed and I wanted to know more about and I wanted to stay with her. But the book is called Middlemarch, it's not called Dorothea. So what George Eliot does is that she takes this small provincial town in 19th century England and she zooms in on very specific characters from that town. And so you spend time with different characters at different times. And of course, I think it's quite impossible to be as invested into all of them, you know, and as you would be into just very specific ones. In my case, it was Dorothea. Don't get me wrong, she's a hugely important character, and later on in the narrative, George Eliot spends more time with, and I enjoy that. That's my favorite part of the book. It's a book that I did enjoy parts of it. I did struggle through other parts of it, and it's a book that I admire more than I liked, if that makes sense. That's why in Goodreads I gave it 4 stars, and I never really talk about stars here. I kind of rate books on Goodreads because that's what it's designed to do. In the past I never used to, by the way, but now I feel like I kind of have to, and it's okay, I don't mind doing that. But I don't think it's all that helpful, you know. But yeah, it's the kind of book that I would give 4 stars to, and I think this is a good opportunity to tell you how my rating works. Well, because for some people a 4 wouldn't be a good rating, or it would mean like, oh, there are problems with the book. That's not the case for me. A 4, it's a book that I admire, that I don't think there's anything wrong with. I get what the author is trying to say, I get what the author is trying to do, and I think the author is doing it right. You know, so she has something that she wants to do and she's doing it right. And I enjoyed part of it, at least. That's a 4. That's a 4 because I don't have anything that I would have changed. A 5, it's all of those things, plus it's a book that I would want to go back to. A book that made a personal impact on me. And that's what was lacking in my reading of Middlemarch, those two things. But it's still a great book, and I'm so happy that thanks to Victober, I was able to finally read it. I also started reading other books, and there are the other books that are in my TBR. I want to read all of them. I'm not going to wait until next October, next Victober to do so. So I might be able to finish my Victober TBR by the end of this year, but I'm not putting any pressure on me. But I'll get to all the books in my TBR. So if you watch my TBR and you're interested in those books, in any of those books or all of those books, don't worry, I'll get to them and I will talk to you about them on my Friday Reads or any other kind of video that I come up with. My other reading project, which is actually a lot more personal, it's my Booker Through the Decades project. So as you probably know if you watch my channel regularly, I'm going through all the books that have won the Booker Prize. But I'm doing so by decade and in order. So I started with the current decade. The book that I read from the current decade was The Narrow Road to the Deep North by Australian writer Richard Flanagan. This is an ongoing project, so I'll keep going until I get to Girl, Woman, Other, which was one of the winners of this year's Booker Prize. I've already read the other winner, The Testaments. You can go ahead and find a review here on my channel. So this project is ongoing, but I'm kind of like taking it a little bit easier with it. So I'm always going to be reading a Booker Prize novel, but I will also be reading a lot of other books at the same time, so it might take me a whole month to get through them. A lot of them are quite chunkers. This one, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, was one that I couldn't quite get into. It was a book that I couldn't connect with, and I discussed it in one of my recent Friday Reads, if you want to know more about what I thought about it when it was a lot fresher in my mind. But it's just a book that I didn't connect with. Too much war. I don't know. I don't really want to talk about it anymore because I talked about it in a previous video, and I really do not have much more to add. And it's not a book that spoke to me. So if you love that book, or if you want to read it, I don't want to discourage you from reading it. It's probably not the right book for me. And I think that's part of the problem with doing this project, or one of the challenges is that I'll come across books that I wouldn't be interested in reading, that I wouldn't necessarily pick up, and because I'm doing this project I feel like I have to, and so I do and I will. But there are books I won't connect with, and then the challenge is how to talk about those books, because this project is different. All the other books that I talk about in my channel are books that I really want to read, so that's why I picked them up. So I will, even if I don't like them, I will always have something to say about them, at least why I wanted to read them. And for this book, the only reason I wanted to read it is because it won the Booker Prize, and I'm doing a Booker Prize Through the Decades project. So it's kind of like the experience reading this novel has made me question my project and whether I should go on with it. But I think this project might also help me to deal with my literary prejudices, and I might be able to discover some interesting books that I wouldn't otherwise pick up. So I think it's worth doing. So I'm gonna keep up with my Booker Through the Decades project. Okay, then also in October I read 3 books in French. I read Amélie Nothom's latest, called Soif, or Thirst. It hasn't been translated into English yet, but if you like Amélie Nothom, I really recommend it. If you haven't read anything by Amélie Nothom, I suggest you go back, look at her backlist. She publishes a book a year. She's been doing that since the early 90s, so there are more than 20 novels by her. They're all quite easy to read and very brief, but they're all fascinating. I've only read a handful of them, so my suggestion, if you're interested in her, would be to go back, look at her backlist and pick something that kind of appeals to you because of its plot or characters. Then I also read 2 books by 19th century French writer Guy de Maupassant. I read his most famous novel Bel Ami, and I read his novella Le Horla, which is a horror novella. And again, I talked about all these 2 books and also Soif in previous and fairly recent Friday Reads. So again, if you want to know more about what I thought about them, go back. I would recommend all 3 of them, and I'm absolutely in love with Guy de Maupassant's writing. He's amazing, and the stories that he tells. Le Horla wasn't quite my cup of tea because it's a horror story, but I still loved it from a technical point of view and still got me engaged. And it's very short. Even if I wasn't that interested in what the story is about, I couldn't help but finish it in just one sitting. I do read a lot of backlist books, and in fact that concept of backlist I've only started using recently, because for me books are books and they don't have a date. I don't care when they were first published. That doesn't bother me. I just want to read good books, whatever I understand as good books, books that satisfy me, that bring me something, that make me think, that challenge me, and that I derive pleasure from reading. But I don't. The problem with that is that I don't pay a lot of attention to contemporary literature as such, which is something that, since doing this channel, I feel like I feel a certain kind of pressure to read more contemporary literature. The problem is that whenever I do, that's a very wide category, but I mean books published very, very recently. So, and whenever I do that, more often than not, I get disappointed. Having said that, I picked up a book that, well, actually disappointed me some, which is Late in the Day by Tessa Hadley. And I think she's a great writer. Just, I couldn't connect with the story. I didn't care about any of the characters, but she is a great writer. So I would recommend her if you're interested in kind of like domestic, heterosexual, contemporary British characters, that kind of thing. Then yeah, it's a great book for that. But it didn't bring me anything. I just felt like I've read plenty of books like that before. But you know, I'm not saying it's not a terrible book. It's in fact a good book. It might be your kind of book. It wasn't my kind of book. So you know. That's what I'm saying, okay? And then I read 3 books in the original Spanish, but the 3 books are available in English, so I'm going to talk about them. The first one is Ficciones by Jorge Luis Borges, which is a book of short stories. I talked about this book in one of my Friday reads. In fact, a couple of Friday reads, I think I mentioned it, but I talked about it in my most recent, I think, Friday reads, because that's when I finished it. And I recommend Borges to anyone who loves literature. That's all I would say about it right now, and I think this is an excellent book to begin its fictions in English, although you might find some of the short stories in this volume in other volumes too. But yeah, whatever you can get by Borges in English or in any language that you can read in, you know, pick it up and read it. You won't be disappointed. Then I also read La Región Más Transparente, which is Where the Air is Clear in English, by Carlos Fuentes. It's a monumental Mexican novel. It's so difficult, so hard to get into, so challenging. There are so many voices. You need to have a background in contemporary Mexican history, definitely the Mexican history of the 20th century. If you're interested in that though, this is a great novel to read. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, if you don't even know where Mexico is on a map, or, well, I'm being facetious, if you don't know much about contemporary history of Mexico, then don't pick it up, because you'll be really confused. But if you know a little bit, you have a certain background, and you want to read a great book that kind of reflects on what happens in the decades following the Mexican Revolution, then you must read this. And if you can read in Spanish, I think it's very well worth reading, although you might need to do some work and find out about Mexican history in order to enjoy it. I have something else in Spanish that I read that is a lot more accessible, which is La Barraca by Blasco Ibáñez. This is a Spanish writer from Valencia. This is a naturalistic novel. It's very short, it's action-packed. I loved the writing. I didn't read this before. This is a very old edition, which belonged to my grandfather's collection. He had the collected works of this author in this very collection, and I have a few tomes. No, I don't have the whole collection, but I have access to a few tomes that now belong to my mom, but I can borrow them, and in fact I stole this one from her, but I'm sure she won't mind. It's very dated. It wouldn't be to everyone's taste, but I recommend it. I had a lot of fun reading this. And I also read a novel by the Argentinian writer Juan José Saer, and he's a writer that I want to read more by, and I want to find out more about his oeuvre, and part of it is because I want to become more acquainted and know Spanish language literature better than I do, because mostly I read in English. But as you can see in this video, and probably in previous videos, I'm trying to change that and trying to open myself up to literature in Spanish and in other languages like French and Portuguese as well. Yeah, I want to find out more about Spanish language literature. You know, Spanish is my first language, so that makes sense. Juan José Saer, you know, he's a namesake. My full name is Juan José. So that kind of adds something to it. You know, it's probably my ego there. But he's not an incredibly well-known writer. He's kind of obscure. It's not that difficult to find, but he's not as well known as your Garcia Marquez and your Vargas Llosas, you know, if you see what I mean. And I'm trying to read stuff by him. So I read his novel Nadie Nunca Nada, which was interesting and so odd, and I don't think it's the best novel to start with. So I'm gonna try to go back and read other novels by him. I don't have coherent thoughts about his writing yet. You know, I feel like I need to read more books, but I'm glad that I read that one. And the final 2 books that I read was because I was very impatient, non-fiction November books. So yeah, I read 2 non-fiction books in October, but they count for Nonfiction November. There are 2 books from my Nonfiction November TBR that you can find here on my channel as well. And the first one was Trick Mirror by Gia Tolentino, collection of essays. Millennial feminist writer Gia Tolentino wrote this collection. She writes for The New Yorker, but all of the essays in this book are original, so you won't find them anywhere else. I think it's worth reading, although the book is incredibly US-centric, so if you're not from the US, or if you're not au fait with US politics and popular culture, particularly the politics and the popular culture of the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years, then you might get a little bit lost in her writing. She's a lucid writer. I recommend this collection, but with that caveat, you know, it's very US-centric. And the other nonfiction November book that I read was The Prince by Niccolò Machiavello. This is a political treatise from Renaissance Italy. It's a book that every politician is supposed to have read, or if you know, basically it's a book in which Niccolò Machiavello tells the reader how to become a prince, which you can translate as president or anything else, depending on your the political regime you live under. You know, whether it's democratic or not won't really make a difference here. And yeah, it's a fascinating book. It shows you how little things have changed, or not necessarily that, because that implies that we you know, there hasn't been any progress in anything, and that's not what I mean. What I mean is that, you know, politicians were very much the same back then as they are now. The word politician probably didn't exist then, that's why he talks about princes. But yeah, it's an eye-opening book, and I recommend it to anyone who's interested, even remotely, into politics. It's also a short book. I'm going to show you an edition that I have, which is this one. This is an edition in Spanish that my boyfriend took out from the local public library. So I just wanted to show you a copy so you could see how thin it is, although this edition has like really tiny print. But I'm sure, you know, this is a very old edition. I'm sure you can find better editions. And of course this book is translated, it was written originally in Italian, but it's been translated into every language, and there would be so many versions out there. You can probably also get it for free on the internet because it's out of copyright. So yeah, those are all the books that I read in October. I'm probably forgetting some books because that always happens when I do this. I think my Goodreads lies to me, and also my memory isn't what it used to be. So I apologize if there were books that I mentioned on my Friday reads that I haven't mentioned before, but that's a good news. If I didn't mention a book that I actually read in October, if I forgot to mention it, you can be sure that if you go back through my Friday reads, you will find it. Let me know what you've been reading in October. Also, let me know what your reading plans are for November, particularly nonfiction November, but also anything else that you're planning on reading. I hope you're very well. Again, I hope you have a great weekend and a great week and a great month, and I'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.